2 of our series in Mark, looking this time at Mark 5 verses 21 through 24, probably the longest passage that we have looked at to this point, entitled Two Unclean Ladies. Last session we ended with Jesus headed back to the northwest beach of the Sea of Galilee, probably in the area of Capernaum. After a tense time, healing a demonized man on the east side of the river Jordan, that is. Before we continue in Mark, though, I'm going to read 3 verses from Leviticus and then tell you why I'm reading these 3 verses. You say, doesn't it appear as though they have anything to do with our verses now? But yes, they do. I'm reading from Leviticus 15, verse 25. Now if a woman has a discharge of her blood many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge, she shall continuing as though she is in her menstrual impurity. Translation, she is unclean. Any bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her like a bed of menstruation, and everything upon which she sits shall be unclean, shall also be unclean, like her uncleanness at that time. And verse 27, likewise, whoever touches them, the things she has lain on or sit on, likewise, whoever touches them shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes, and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. So that's verses 25 through 27. Well, why make an issue of uncleanness surrounding natural and unnatural issues of blood? It's about uncleanness. Touching certain things, ceremonial uncleanness to the one who touches them, and possible for anyone considering as the cause of the touching of the unclean matter. And what fall among those things that touch may bring uncleanness? I'm going to name 3 in relationship to our last session, this session, and the next session. What are those 3 things? Anything demonic, and we just dealt with a demonic man. Anything dealing with blood, and the session or the message from Leviticus that I read had to do with a woman's blood. This session we will deal with a woman having a definite difficulty with her blood. And the third, tombs, graves, death. I gave 3 terms, but they all relate to death. And that will be the 3rd session in the series of 3. One next after after this one, and it will deal with Jairus' daughter. All three of these narratives are extremely well known, so you probably have known them. Hopefully we can demonstrate some things you have not been exposed to. Last session, Jesus, again, we said, as I said a moment ago, dealt with a man having many demons. He was definitely unclean. This session, we will examine the case of blood, a woman's case of blood, and next time again, the case of the death of Jairus' daughter. You might say that we're on a run of 3 episodes when Jesus encounters and ends uncleanness. If you've never thought about it before, think of this. Whenever Jesus touches someone or something unclean, he himself does not become unclean because his touch cleanses. Let's start in verse 21 of Mark 5. And when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, that would be the northwest side, as we've mentioned a couple times, a great multitude gathered about him. So here are the multitudes back again. And he stayed by the seashore. Contrast that with where he just came from. He came from a shore on the eastern side where all the crowds that gathered begged him to leave. Here, they're sticking like glue to him. Let's look at what was happening with the pressing crowds. Still having trouble saying words carefully and properly. Mark 5, verses 22 and 23. And one of the synagogue officials named Jairus, so we get Jairus today, but we'll get his situation next time. 23. And one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up. We get Jairus today, we get his situation and his event tomorrow. And let's see what goes on. And upon seeing him, he sees Jesus. He fell at his feet and entreated him, Jesus, earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her that she may get well and live. We don't know how Jairus came to know of Jesus and Jesus' power to heal, or why he would believe what he did hear and know. Did he see Jesus raise someone from the dead? We don't have any idea, although Jesus had, as I recall in the sequence of things, raised a widow's son at Nain. And so he may have known of that. But anyhow, who was he? Well, he's called the ruler of the synagogue. That would make him a well-respected layman, not a priest, a layman who led the synagogue's board of elders, who were also laymen. In administering, not normally teaching, administering the affairs of the synagogue. So we would have seen to the scrolls, he would have seen to the building, he would have seen to the grounds, and being responsible through the board of elders for all of that. But he was a layman. But they would typically be laymen who were considered faithful, knowledgeable, moral, all the good traits you would expect a church leader to be. Apparently, without negotiation or hesitation, rather than talk, Jesus chose to act in verse 24. And he, Jesus, went off with him, Jairus, and a great multitude was following him and pressing in on him. The him here, of course, is Jesus, not Jairus. But notice the previous verses, him did refer to Jairus. So when you have a lot of pronouns floating around, you need to be very careful to see whom they represent. Jairus with Jesus following him, and a huge crowd following them, pressing in all around Jesus. That's the setting we have. We don't know how far it had to go, but it was obviously a procession that one would realize was unusual. Meanwhile, an interruption was waiting in the wings. But that interruption was not going to wait long. Verse 25 through 27. And a woman who had had a hemorrhage, there's your issue of blood, for 12 years, and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had. So they had not helped her, apparently, but they had taken her money. And by the way, as I understand it, in that day and that culture, that would have been fairly typical, that physicians were limited in their ability to help, and so you might have to go hither, yonder, everywhere trying to seek help. But she was not helped at all, but in fact, but rather, had grown worse. But after hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. Now, to the modern person, that seems very strange. You have a problem, so you go up and touch this guy's coat, and you're healed? Doesn't make sense to me. There's a little extra piece of information that might be helpful in the woman's difficulty also. It sounds as though, and I'll read the verse in a second, it sounds as though Luke's words may have led you to believe that Luke believed her issue might not be healable by human means. And I'm reading from Luke verse 43 of chapter 8. Luke 8:43. And this is just a portion of a complete sentence. And a woman who had a hemorrhage, that's the same woman we're talking about, for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone. That sounds like Luke may have thought no human being's going to touch this. But it was a simple description of the woman's act, something that she seems to have, that seems should have gone unnoticed. A woman, people are pressing all around Christ. She comes up from behind, he can't see her. She reaches out and touches him. It shouldn't have been any big deal. But it did not go unnoticed. noticed. And I'm sure you remember who noticed. The woman's act drove her by the failure of the medical community to help her, but the only thing they did is take her money. What did she think touching a tassel on Jesus' outer robe do? And that tassel would have been at the very low part of his robe. Well, look at Mark 5:28. For she thought, if I just touch his garments, I shall get well. That portion of her belief system is superstition, of course. Touching garments can't do anything for you in and of itself. It's an inanimate object. But in that time and culture and that faith, the faith of most cultures at that time, faith and superstition were mixed in every life. It was believed by many that touching the clothing of a healer would heal. The idea is he has power to heal. If I touch his clothes, I will gain some of that power and therefore very possibly being healed. So, let's look at verse 29. And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up. Can you imagine? I have no idea how to get any sense of what she felt in her body when that healing took place. Immediately, there's Mark's word again, this was something that was going to be instant and complete. And she felt in her body, Mark says, that she was healed of her affliction. You ever wonder that? What about somebody who's been lame all of their life, have never walked? And Jesus says, get up, take your back bed, and go. Can you imagine? There must have been some kind of sensation that caused them to believe that what Jesus claimed had just happened. Wouldn't it be tremendous to have some instance where you sense that same kind of power and event? We have we're not told anything about it, except apparently every time they knew. Okay? And Jesus isn't caught off guard. He's always alert and he's always aware. Look at verse 30. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself, don't know how he sensed that either. And well, I never will, because I won't have, excuse me, that kind of power. And immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around, and in the crowd, they were all around him, remember, and he said, who touched my garments? Now we're going to see that even after the storming of the sea that shook them when they were crossing over on the other side, and then seeing Jesus negotiate the cleansing of a demonized man of who knows how many demons. We don't know for sure. We know there were multiple. They saw that, but still we're going to see that they thought Jesus' question was a stupid question. Mark 5, verse 31. And his disciples, that's his 12, some of them, said to him, Jesus, you see the multitude pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? You're nuts. Yeah, that's not in Scripture, of course, but that's the way it sounds they were thinking. Jesus didn't respond, but he tried to set out to find for himself. Verse 32 and 33. And he, Jesus, looked around to see the woman who had done this. I mean, as the crowd was tight, she couldn't get away very quickly either. Verse 33. But the woman, fear and trembling, why? She'd been discovered doing something clandestinely, yes, but why should be afraid? Well, there were consequences to an unclean person touching a clean person. Aware of what had happened to her, she came and fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. Keep in mind, there were consequences for being unclean and intentionally touching a clean person. You're really not even supposed to be within X feet of such a person. What were some of the consequences? Shunning, exclusion from the synagogue, the temple, and there were other punishments available also. But what was Jesus' response? And he said to her, verse 34, daughter, notice he didn't even say woman. He said, daughter, he took her in a step of love. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. And then finishes by saying, and be healed of your afflictions, which she knew she was. But that's interesting. What did he call what saved her? Faith. Your daughter, your faith, which we know from what we started this session with, it was a mixture of faith and superstition. He didn't challenge the superstition, but he intentionally, I think, sought her out to speak to her so she knew it was faith, not superstition, that made her well. Some say that has saved you. Well, that word can be used to mean saved, but it more likely is used to mean delivered, or in this case translated, made you well. Go in peace. Peace with whom? With your disease, and probably in the end with God. And he said, he reaffirmed, you are healed of your affliction. Well, that's the second event in which Jesus dealt with a person who was unclean and left them clean. The third situation will be Jairus' daughter. We'll look at that next time. Maybe slowly by slowly, the number of words I mess up badly will diminish.